At this time, I'd like to introduce Matthew Femmel. Matthew is a retired United States Marine and veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's currently the Director of International Sales for Colt and a member of the Board for the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. He will introduce our keynote speaker. Matt.
Thank you, Bob. I'm not used to talking into a microphone, so apologize. My voice tends to carry without the aid of electronics. When Megan asked me if I would introduce our guest today, I had to chuckle because anybody who's ever served in the military here knows that an officer will never give up an opportunity to say a couple words. And although I do have some formal written remarks here that will allow me to hit some high points of our guest career, I absolutely would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to advance the rivalry between the U.S. Marines and the U.S. Army, because it's not every single day that a Marine gets to introduce the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. So very simply put, I will say that this is definitely not the first nor the last time that a Marine has had to provide forcible entry for the United States Army. To put boots on the deck, the boots have just been replaced with Johnston Murphys, that's all. But in all seriousness, I do have the distinct honor to be able to introduce our keynote speaker. Our distinguished guest is a true American patriot and has been a public servant for literally his entire life. As a son of a distinguished U.S. Army officer, he was born in occupied Japan during World War II, or following World War II, and grew up on Army bases all over the country and all over the world. He returned to his family's home state of Massachusetts to attend high school, went on to receive a bachelor's degree from Georgetown and a master's degree from the University of Denver. Of particular note for the football fans in the audience, as a summer job one year, he had an opportunity to work for Vince Lombardi, who happened to be coaching the Redskins at the time. As an infantry officer in the United States Army, he was a field commander at every level from platoon through division, to include combat service in Bosnia in the late 1990s. As a senior general officer, he served in various positions within the Pentagon and as the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army before he was selected to command Multinational Force Iraq in 2005, which was during the height of the Operation Iraqi Freedom insurgency. For 2.5 years, he was in charge of every aspect of the war in Iraq, leading a coalition of all 4 branches of the United States military, as well as militaries from over 30 allied nations. In 2007, the general was selected to lead the most powerful army in the world. For 4 years, he would answer the challenge to sustain his force for a fight on 2 fronts, and to retain talented and experienced personnel, and to equip and train them with the best that money could buy. Retiring from uniformed service in 2011, our guest has been very active in public speaking, not only at events like this, but also to academia and to corporate leadership programs. He's a college professor, has authored his own book, several magazine articles, and he serves on a number of boards to include the USO and Connecticut's own iconic and historic company, Colt. I have served under his charge both as a Marine in Iraq and more recently as an employee of Colt. And ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute privilege to introduce one of the most well-respected and intellectual and war-fighting generals of modern military history, General George Casey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, no, please. Thanks. I'm always a little nervous when I get a standing ovation before I speak. I mean, it kind of ratchets the bar up a little bit. But since Matt started off with Army Marine jokes, stories, it reminds me of a joke also. And the story is that there's a Marine Corps pilot, a Army general, and a crusty Army sergeant major. And they're all in a prisoner of war camp. And one day the Don comes in and says, I have some bad news. Tomorrow at dawn, you're all going to face the firing squad, but I'm here to grant you your last request. So he goes up to the Marine pilot and says, Major, what's your last request? And the Major says, I would like to have my last meal by candlelight with a beautiful woman. He says, it will be done. He goes up to the Army General and says, General, what's your last request? And the General sucks himself up to his full height of 5'9" and says, I'd like to address the troops one more time. He says, it will be done. And he goes up to this non-commissioned officer and he says, Sergeant, what's your last request? And he says, I'd like to be shot an hour before the general starts talking. So hopefully you don't feel that way by the time I'm done here. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout on a dreary Saturday morning to talk about the international security environment. Because I can't think of a time in my lifetime when having an informed, engaged citizenry is more important. So good on you for turning out. Now, the other thing before I start, one of the questions I always get when I'm out speaking is, what's it like, General? What's it like going from being in charge of an army of 1 million people with a staff of hundreds that at your beck and call, and a G5 that flies you all over the world, to going to becoming really what I'll call an army of one, you and your iPhone. And I must say, it was an interesting transition. And I actually struggled to figure out how to explain that transition to people. And then a couple of years ago, right before the holidays, I was doing the crossword puzzle at home. And I'm going along, and the clue was Army head, 7 letters. I said, that's easy, General. Boom, move on. So I keep on working. And you know when you're doing a crossword puzzle that you realize that something's not working, something's not right? And I kept going back to General. And after a while, I realized it wasn't Army head, it was Army head, and the answer was latrine. And so that's really kind of what it was like, going from General to the latrine. Anyway, I wanted to give you that because I think a lot of what we'll talk about this morning is depressing. And I was listening to some conversations in the men's room here before, and people were saying they might need a couple of drinks at lunch here if it gets any worse. But I'd like to give you a soldier's view of the international security environment. And it's a view that I framed over the course of my 41 years in the military, which ran from the waning days of Vietnam to the early days of the Arab Spring. And frankly, it's a view that's continued to evolve over time. I'll make 3 points with you today. First of all, over that period, the threat has changed significantly with the addition of non-state actors. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Secondly, this struggle that we're in with Islamic extremism is a long-term ideological struggle. We are closer to the beginning of this than we are to the end, and we need to think about it in those terms. This is going to be with us for a long time. And third, I'm going to suggest that some of the trends that I see out there in the international environment are only going to make the existing situations more complicated, especially in the near to midterm. All right? And then I'll try to conclude with just a few thoughts on what is it that we can do as a country to guide us through this period. All right? And then I'll throw it open for questions here. So hopefully I'll talk maybe 30 or 40 minutes and then open it up for all your questions. All in favor? Okay, good. Okay, so first, the threats change. And last night at the reception, we had a very unscientific poll of what people thought were the greatest threats facing us. And I just ask each of you now, just to think for a minute. Think of everything that's going on out there, but ask yourself the question, what is the most significant national security threat to the United States of America today? Just think about it for a minute. I'm not going to ask you for it. Just think about it, because I want you to have something in your heads to put the rest of this in context. Got it? So last night, as I said, very unscientific results. Cyber came out as the most significant threat by a very, very wide margin. North Korea was a very distant second, and China was an even more distant third. And there were some others after that, but those were the top three. As I looked at what's changed over my career, it used to be that if you could control the conduct of states, you had some hope of maintaining global order. And over hundreds of years, conventions and treaties have been, were made and drawn up to govern the conduct of states and govern the conduct of states in war. On September 11th, we were struck with a very, very different problem. 19 terrorists in an hour and 17 minutes murdered 2,977 people from 90 countries and inflicted tens of billions of dollars of economic damage on a state. So now you have a non-state actor that has the capability of inflicting catastrophic damage on a state. And that's a fundamentally different challenge. So now, not only do you have to regulate and maintain contacts with states, you've got to deal with these non-state actors who are difficult, if not impossible, to deter. And that's a much, much harder challenge. So I'm going to take a quick walk around the world, but I want you to keep that non-state actor part in your minds. And I'm going to start with the Middle East, because that's where I think the challenge is most significant. And if you look at the Middle East, it seems like it's coming unglued from Pakistan to Morocco. And I'll start with the Syrian Civil War. It's in its 6th-year war. By even conservative estimates, about 470,000 people have died. About 11 million people have been displaced. That's about half the population of Syria. And about half of that has been displaced outside of Syria, and it's destabilizing Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. About 1 million refugees have pushed their way into Europe. So it's been a significant destabilizing factor. But as I've looked at this, what started out as an uprising against a dictator now it's got so many different complicating factors that I don't know how we put it back together. And here's what I'm talking about. In addition to this struggle to depose a dictator, you've got a sectarian struggle between the Sunni majority, which is about 80% of the country, and the Alawite minority, which is less than 20% of the country. And the idea of deposing Assad and his regime, which is the only organization in the country right now that has any semblance of an opportunity to maintain order, could unleash a bloodbath, a sectarian bloodbath, the likes of which we haven't seen. Secondly, you have an internecine Sunni struggle between the rebels, between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. Third, you have the Kurdish move for independence up in the north. Fourth, you have a regional conflict between the major Sunni players, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and Iran, who's working very hard to position themselves in Syria so they can continue to support Hezbollah and threaten Israel. And then lastly, for the last 2 years, you've got a geopolitical struggle between two nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, for control in that region. Now, it doesn't get any harder than that. And I don't see how this gets put back together without a very large international peacekeeping force that goes in there for a long time to maintain order while they sort things out inside. And we're not going to get there unless we work with Russia to make that happen. So this is going to go on. If it's the 6th year now, we'll still be talking about this in a decade, hopefully not at the same level that we're talking about this now. Now, I'm going to try to also give you a little bit of good news as I go through this. And the good news is that 2 years ago, at this time, ISIS controlled an area in western Iraq and eastern Syria that was about the size of Jordan. It was a huge area. They declared a state. The good news is that as of this month, ISIS has really been kicked out of Iraq, except for a small piece around Hawija, and their holdings in Syria have been significantly downsized to where they control just a narrow area along the Euphrates Valley and a small area in central Syria. So in The Economist at the beginning of this month, they declared that ISIS as a territory holder was spent. And that's a good thing, because we cannot allow terrorist safe havens to exist today around the world. So that's just Syria. If you look at Iraq, they have made some progress. But they are an awful long way of enfranchising the Sunni population, which is the fundamental thing that has to happen to reduce that levels of violence there. And just good things happen all the time. And this week, the Kurds, who make up about 20% of the country, have had a referendum where they all voted for independence from Iraq. So that's only going to complicate things. Iran, that continuing to work to destabilize the region, and they're an awful long way from being a productive player in the international community. And they're working very hard and fomenting Sunni Shia tensions that's only complicating an already difficult problems around the Middle East. And Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, the regime with our support continues to hold the ground against resurgent Taliban. And you've read recently we're going to ratchet up our support there. And we have to continue to deny Afghanistan as a safe haven for terrorists. If we were to walk away from that, we would have a ISIS and Al-Qaeda presence very quickly, and that would be to all of our detriments. So, Middle East. And you can see, I think, how these non-state actors are having a significant impact on already difficult state problems. So let's go to something that's a little easier. Let's go to Europe. I think the fundamental challenge facing Europe right now is Russia. And if it's been 3.5 years since Russia annexed the Crimea, it's been 3 years since they went into eastern Ukraine, and it's been 6 years since they invaded Georgia. And so, one of the questions that I'm always asking myself is, what's going on? What are they up to? I think fundamentally for me, it's two things. One historic, one more recent. I think what you're seeing is Russia looking to at least preserve some semblance of buffers around their borders to protect them. And this is a historic Russian effort. And I think that's what you see happening. They are putting down a line in the sand that says no more NATO expansion, particularly in countries like Ukraine and Belarus, and probably no EU membership for that either. And the second thing is that I don't think we in the West fully appreciate how Russians in general and Russian leaders in particular feel like that they have been treated by NATO and the West since the collapse of the wall. And I've interacted with Russian leaders during that time, and they believe that Russia is a great power. It still remains the only country on earth that is an existential threat to us, and they should be treated like a great power. We obviously have some differences. But for us, I think it's very important for us to maintain our NATO connections and our NATO Article 5 commitments to deter any further Russian aggression. I think Putin has taken From our actions, he has taken it as a given that we will not intervene in non-NATO periphery countries. But what he doesn't know is, will we, the United States, still honor our NATO Article 5 commitments? And I think it's very, very important that we continue to reinforce that. I want to just say a couple of words about the Ukraine, because it's kind of been off everybody's screen. And a good friend of mine, General John Abizaid, was asked by Secretary Mattis to go there and assist the defense minister. So he's been on the ground and he's seen what's happening there. And the way he describes the war going on there is World War I with technology. And here's what he means by that. Basically, both sides are dug in and the battle lines are drawn. And so that's trench warfare, much like you saw in World War I, and the damage is being done by artillery and by snipers. To give you an idea of the pace of combat, the Ukrainian army loses 5 to 10 soldiers a week. Most recently, most of them have been to snipers. So that's kind of the World War I part. The technology part is that he's seeing very creative use of electronic warfare, of drones, of cyber attacks, and very sophisticated information warfare. And as I look at that, I say that's what we need to be prepared for as a military down the road. I think what's going on there is going to be in a stalemate for a while. They're talking, and Russia is suggesting that we bring in an international peacekeeping force along the present line of contact. The Ukrainians, quite rightly, are suggesting, okay, bring in a peacekeeping force, but let's put it on the former border. And so that's where it is now, and I suspect it'll stay there for a while. So that's the fundamental challenge that I think European countries are dealing with. To the Far East, China. My personal view is China is an economic competitor. It is not a military threat to us. That said, they continue to increase their defense budget by about 10 or 12% a year, and there's no question that they are pressing their, in my view, illegitimate claims in the South China Sea. And they're building up the capability to extend their reach and protect themselves. Pakistan. I mean, instability in Pakistan threatens a nuclear power. And the Pakistanis continue to assure us that they have the nukes under control. And I have no doubt that they work very hard to do that. But I just, when the issue can become, give me the keys or we'll kill your family, I mean, the keys are suspect. So that to me is tension. Oh, did I mention North Korea? Is that on anybody's mind? We're probably, I mean, the discussion and the diatribe going back and forth here has brought the prospect of nuclear war back to a place I haven't seen it really since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That said, I personally don't think the threat is as real as it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. North Korea is a nuclear power. They've got, we think, probably a half a dozen or so nuclear weapons. They are working very hard to be able to mount those nuclear weapons on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Why are they doing that? Lots of theories. The one I subscribe to is if they can reach the United States with a nuclear weapon, they can put us in a position where we have to think about trading Seattle for Seoul. And that might give them more freedom to maneuver to reunite the Korean Peninsula by force. That's a theory. So what do we do about that? One, go back to the fact that North Korea is a nuclear power. This is much harder than it was with Iran. With Iran, they were an evolving nuclear power. They didn't have it yet. North Korea's got them. And the kind of the word on the street is, if you got nukes, don't give them up because they'll overthrow you. The Ukrainians were telling my friend General Abizaid, we wish we didn't give up our nukes. They weren't their nukes, they were the Russian nukes in Ukraine, but they gave them up. And they feel like if they had them, Russia would have been deterred. So I believe that we still need to work to reduce the threat from North Korean missiles and nuclear weapons. But I honestly believe that we need to prepare ourselves that North Korea is not going to give up everything that they've worked so hard to develop, and we need to think about how we might live with a ninth nuclear power. And that's a different context. And the choice for any administration is war, nuclear war, or learn to live with it. And we'll see where that goes. Now, how do you get them to give up anything? How do you get this down to an acceptable level of threat? And the answer to that is, for me, is significant diplomacy. One of the things about the Iran nuclear deal, no matter what you think about it, that I'm surprised that more people don't talk about, is the fact that Russia, China, the United States, and the European Union held together for over several years to impose very tight sanctions and to get the agreement. That's the same kind of thing that I believe needs to happen with North Korea and China, Russia, probably the European Union and Japan and South Korea need to come together, and we need to impose much, much harsher sanctions than have been imposed to date. And we need to turn the screws down. But we need to do that knowing that we're probably not going to get complete disarmament, nuclear disarmament, out of North Korea. And that's going to take some time. Last thing about this, I hear a lot of people say, well, this guy's a lunatic. Kim Jong-un is a lunatic. I personally don't think so. I think he's acting in his country's interest, and he's acting in a way to preserve what he sees to preserve his regime. I don't think he's stupid enough to attack us. But I don't, but you never know, and that's what makes it interesting. So, this administration is in a tough position because previous administrations over the last decades, they've kicked the can down the road on this. And now we're at a point where, we have to figure out how we lessen the threat to our country. So, Far East. Finally, and this gets back to the non-state actors. I mean, the recent terrorist attacks in London, Barcelona, and Manchester remind me that the United States and our allies remain under the threat of significant terrorist attack. And again, another thing I don't hear talked about much is these terrorist organizations are out pursuing the acquisitions of weapons of mass destruction. Radiological, chemical, biological, I include cyber in that, and to some extent nuclear. And I've been saying that before I saw the finale of 24, but I've been saying it since about 2007, that we should expect a weapon of mass destruction attack on a established country in the next 5 years. Now, I've never been more happy to be wrong about something, but for me, it's only a matter of time. And to me, that is the greatest threat that I see coming to us. Now, on the good news, bad news side of this, it's not all bad news, looking around the globe. First of all, I think this is significant. There's prosperity happening around the world. In the last 25 years, over 1 billion people have come out of poverty, most of those in China. That's a significant accomplishment. The second thing, and this is interesting, I saw this study probably a couple of years ago, but the war-related deaths in the first decade of the 21st century are lower than any other decade in the last 100 years. Think about that. You see all this violence on television going around, but it's nothing. It's 1/100th of what it was like during World War II, where tens of millions of people died. And it's about 1/3 of what it is during the Cold War. So even though we see all the violence on the time, it is still not as significant as it has historically been. So that's not a bad thing. Third, the likelihood of major state-on-state conflict any place but the Korean Peninsula, I think, is increasingly low. And even if there was to be significant conflict, it would be much reduced in scope and scale from example, World War II. And just by way of explaining that, at the height of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact had about 225 tank and motorized rifle divisions. Russia today has 22. So they are not anywhere near capable of wreaking the devastation that they were capable of wreaking in Europe in the mid-90s. And lastly, North Korea aside, the existential threat from Russia's nuclear weapons against us that I grew up with and some of you grew up with in the 50s and 60s, I think is also remarkably low. So not all bad news, but it isn't great. And the reality is that we have to be prepared today to deal with both state actors behaving badly through proxies and using new and different asymmetric tools to skirt international laws and conventions, and non-state actors who have and will continue to refine the capability to inflict catastrophic damage on states. And that's a fundamentally different challenge for not just the military, but for local law enforcement authorities and governments around the world. Okay, next, long-term ideological struggle. I think of what's going on now in duration more in terms of the Cold War. And if you think about it, September 2015 was the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. The previous November was the 25th anniversary of the wall coming down. The Cold War was 45 years. We've been at this 16 years. We're much closer to the beginning of this than we are to the end. And this is going to go on for a while. And it will have a destabilizing effect for a significant period. But the really hard thing, I think, for Americans to come to grips with is this is not a struggle that we can win by ourselves. This is a struggle that can only be won within Islam, when moderate Islamists triumph over the extremists. And so we can't go out and, quote, kill our way out of this. We can help and aid others in dealing with the problems and dealing with the root causes of terrorism. But all of those root causes are primarily economic, and they take a long time to resolve themselves. So we need to put ourselves in a mindset that this is going to be with us for a while. And lastly, let me just quickly on trends. If the environment isn't already complicated enough, the trends out there I see are going to make it more difficult, especially in the short term. First of all, it's technology. Technology is accelerating the pace of change and binding us closer and closer together. On September 11th, there were about 500 million people online. Any thoughts on how many there are today? About 3.8 billion. And they send about 200 billion emails a day. How about cell phone subscribers? Anybody idea how many cell phone subscribers we have out there? Over 7 billion. So we have more cell phone subscribers than we have people in the world. And they're much better connected. 1.8 billion people on Facebook. Zuckerberg says he's going to take that to 5 to 7 billion people by 2030 by using drones to get it out there. 650 million or so people signed up on Twitter. About 350 people use it monthly. 75% of those folks, both for Facebook and Twitter, are outside the United States. And what that means is that people who never had any view of what went on outside their neighborhood now can see what's going on around the world. They have 24/7 access to information. And when they look online and see what other people have, it's created a global awakening of expectations that people very impatiently want filled. And that's creating a lot of friction, particularly for new governments. And when people look outside on their phones, what they see is this is the second point, the global distribution of wealth is significantly skewed. 20% of the population of the world controls 75% of the world's wealth. And there's still 3 billion people living on less than $2.50 a day, which is the poverty level. That's a lot of folks that need to continue the march to prosperity. And demographic challenges within some of these developing countries where high birth rates create youth bulges. So you have significant populations of underage men and women who need to be fed, clothed, educated, cared for, and employed. And this is challenging already strapped governments. And in countries that are able to deal with that, it's creating larger and larger middle classes that are increasing the demand on things like food and fuel. The middle class in China and India, in both countries, is larger than the population of the United States. That's a lot of two-car families. And that's a lot of demand for resources. And then, lastly, because of the change that was started by the Arab Spring, you have countries where a lot of these people live and a lot of this friction is taking place that are trying to chart a future political direction at the same time as they're trying to right their economies. And these governments, they have no hope of meeting the impatient expectations of their populations anytime soon. And that creates friction, and that, in my view, makes people more susceptible to recruiting by extremist organizations. So, we're involved in a long-term ideological struggle, so we're going to be at this for decades. And the addition of non-state actors who can inflict catastrophic damage on states has significantly complicated the security challenges facing our governments. And the trends that are out there are only going to increase this, particularly in the short to near term. So I believe that we, as a country, and we really as a world, are in for several decades of what I call persistent conflict. Protracted confrontation among states, non-states, and individual actors who are increasingly willing to use violence or illegal means to accomplish their political objectives. And that's what I was preparing the Army for when I was the Army Chief of Staff. And I believe that is our future. Now, okay, General, thanks. What do you do about that? Just a couple of quick thoughts on that. First of all, we, the United States of America, has to stay engaged in the world. We cannot roll up our borders and hide behind our oceans. That it just doesn't work. I find as I study conflicts, we seem to always take the wrong lessons from the last war. The lesson from the Iraq War was not stay home. It was not no boots on the ground. It was using what forces we put in to countries to accomplish our political objectives and prepare more effectively. We need to understand, and I mean, by staying engaged, we need to understand that we're not the global cop. We're not even the global hall monitor. And it is not our responsibility to solve everybody else's problems. There's a difference between staying engaged and going out there and try to fix everything. And it takes a lot of patience because, as I said, it's about economic growth and prosperity, and those things take a long time, especially for developing countries, to achieve. So, first thing, stay engaged, stay committed. Secondly, we need to lead, but we need to lead collaboratively. And what do I mean by that? Some of you will recall during the Obama administration, the president talked about leading from behind. And everybody kind of went, ew. That's just, it didn't seem like it was American. You know, we lead from the front. But actually, that was a term that the military used in Iraq to tell our soldiers that what we wanted them to do was to lead from behind in getting the Iraqi security forces to do what we wanted them to do without telling them or without doing it for them. So that's the spirit of that. We are the United States of America is the indispensable catalyst that can bring countries together. And no one can mask the military, the moral, and the economic power that the United States brings to bear. We've demonstrated that while we will act in our own interest, we're not in it for material gain. And so I think we need to work to build coalitions that help other people solve their problems. That's what I mean by leading collaboratively. And then lastly, the challenges facing us are not challenges that are going to be solved by military means alone. And we need to employ integrated, multifaceted approaches. Development, defense, and diplomacy. All those things have to go hand in hand. You know, a lot of people think that the foreign aid budget is a huge portion of the national budget. It's less than 1% goes to foreign aid. And there was a move to cut it by about a third. From a military person, that's crazy. I actually work with the United States Global Leadership Coalition, which is a coalition of former military leaders, former foreign service officers, and industry to work together to basically lobby for the foreign aid budget. And it's that important. 10 out of our top 15 trading partners were once aid recipients. And what I found that when you raise prosperity, you drive down instability. And when you do that, you also create conditions for U.S. investment. So stay engaged, lead collaboratively, and employ multifaceted, integrated approaches. Let me close here just by saying a few words about the men and women of the armed forces. And because I really can't address a civilian audience without talking about that. About 2.7 million men and women have served this country in Iraq and Afghanistan since September 11th. Almost 7,000 of them have given their lives. And they've left over 25,000 surviving family members. I wear this bracelet with the name of Sergeant First Class Rand Lamerson on it, who was a soldier that was killed in Iraq under my command. I wear this to remind me of the human cost of war. Over 50,000 men and women have been wounded, about 10,000 of them seriously enough to require long-term care. 1.7 million men and women have already left the service, and around 150,000 of them are unemployed. We can do better than that as a country. And if I've learned nothing else in my 41 years of government service is don't expect the government to do everything. In fact, we don't want the government to even try to do everything. If the men and women are veterans, are going to receive the care they deserve, it's going to take public-private partnership. So I just would encourage you to get involved and do whatever you can to support the transition and reintegration of the men and women who have served this country so well. All right. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions from you about whatever you would like to talk about. Thank you.
General Casey, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for your service.
You're very kind. The difference between generals and politicians is when generals do that, they mean it.